Good afternoon. Thanks, Dr. Gerard, for that wonderful introduction. And more especially, where's Dr. Spangler? Thank you for this most gracious invitation to come here and chat with the wonderful students, faculty, and I think we even have some commercial business folks in here this afternoon. So thanks again for having me. So over about the next 30 or so minutes, I'm going to talk about a very unique topic that's a little bit different than most of the ones you've seen today. There we go. I want to talk about terror organizations and the use of cyber. Some people might term it cyber terrorism. I have a little bit different spin, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And I might even ask a few questions of the audience to determine some of the terrorist organizations and or what they may be doing out on the internet that we have talked about most of today. Well, Dr. Paulette talked about Pandora's box. I have a little bit different spin on a couple of things. One of which is, by the end of this, I think everybody will figure out what the difference between a fairy tale is and a war story. We'll get to that in a few minutes. So with respect to cyber, I've defined cyber in this context as desktop computers, smart devices, and the networks that transverse the data that we're trying to process across those, just so we're clear about that, versus infrastructure, if you will, as in SCADA or other things we've talked about previously. While a number of terrorist groups have used or use cyber to communicate and do other things on the internet, I'm going to focus for about the next 30 minutes on two of the more known terrorist groups in the recent context, which are Al-Qaeda and more recently ISIS. Everybody's familiar with those two groups, I think. It's been in the news a lot lately. Real quick, a couple of historical perspectives if everybody can see. In 1998, there were only 12 terrorist websites. And about 5 years later, this had grown to 2,700 terrorist websites during the internet boom of the late 90s and early 2000. Anybody have any idea by about 2009 and 10 how many websites were up? Anybody guess, gander? About 10,000. And then in the current context, there's about 20,000 internet websites run by terrorist organizations or those that facilitate what they do. And what's noteworthy in that is that doesn't include social media platforms, mobile applications, chat rooms, or blogs. So when you look at the breadth of the places that they can put information, recruiting, et cetera, and we'll talk more about that in a minute, it's pretty perverse across the entire internet. One of the things that's wholly unique in this is prior to 9/11, Al-Qaeda pretty much transmitted either through regular media outlets or, as we have seen in some of the movies, actually thumb drives and or videotapes that they hand delivered to people to communicate their propaganda, if you will. Within their propaganda, it discussed their ideology, you know, the religious ideology. They're Sunnis, and that particular vein of Sunni, the radical Islam, if you will. But it also is a secondary use. It was a mechanism to try and actually recruit people. And we'll talk about more about recruiting in a few seconds. So they used the traditional outlets. So we're going to come back to that in a few minutes. And that's going to be pretty interesting as we see what ISIS has done with how they recruit. What happened in the late 1990s and early 2000s is with the advent of the internet, that became a game changer for Al-Qaeda and how they distribute their media and propaganda across the internet. It was a real game changer and almost back then we used the terminology now as disruptive technology. It was a real game changer back then and how they could actually extend and communicate their messages, not just to local groups, but actually to a worldwide audience. With anything, if you look at why did they maximize the use of cyber as I previously described it, one, it's accessible. It's easy to get to. Now I do want to outline that the internet as we look at it in the West is far different than connecting and accessibility to the internet in a lot of the Middle Eastern countries. If anybody's ever traveled over there, the internet's a little bit sparse, but it's still accessible. One of the distinguishing facts in that is in the United States, why it's more accessible is we actually have the infrastructure in the United States. Most of the countries in the Middle East, while they have electricity, don't have the infrastructure to support internet transactions like we do in the United States. which is why over time, cell phones became so prevalent in that part of the world and smart devices, because they only need a cell tower and they don't need the rest of the infrastructure to communicate. And that's a keynote that we're going to talk about a little bit more. The inexpensive really refers to the ability to do this, as we would say, on the cheap. But the more important point in this is, if it's inexpensive, that allows them to use funds for other means. Just like any company in the United States, they're looking to save money. And in this case, they're using this money to either, the three big things in a terrorist organization that you need are more recruits, which you have to pay recruits. You need supplies, weapons, et cetera, and that requires money. And the last big thing you need is money with that. So if you're saving expenses on the inexpensiveness, if you will, of connected to the internet, that means they can go to other more profitable or, and unfortunately, more dangerous things that they're going to perpetrate. Anonymous. I know that Dr. Paulette talked about your cell phone and all of those neat things. But with the internet, one of the interesting things and why terrorists use it is it's anonymous. However, it doesn't always mean that it's secure. So anonymity is a critical point in why they use the internet in so many different ways. Regulations. A lot of what the terrorist organizations do on the internet is specifically done to circumvent either US laws or laws of the West. Europe, think of the Europe and the United States specifically. One example is, some time ago, a number of organizations with their websites and propagating death and kill these people translated into lawsuits in the United States brought on by the US government. However, those lawsuits in many cases were dismissed because they said it was the First Amendment and they had the right to actually put that information out on the internet, even though it did, in some cases, incite riots and killings and radicalization. So they spend a lot of time trying to work around our laws and exploit our legal system and our way of life here. Access. It's a worldwide audience. Previously, as I talked about with Al-Qaeda, they were hand distributing videos, CDs, or thumb drives to get their message out. With the advent of the internet, they were able to distribute their messages to a worldwide Islamic community. You think about how big the Islamic community is worldwide. Their marketing and professing of their ideology was able to span not just countries or neighborhoods, it was able to span continents. So that's another key point in the pervasiveness of how they were able to exploit the internet. Here we go. A couple of points. Anybody ever heard of an email technique where you actually can communicate with somebody else, but a message never transmits across the internet? Anybody? Anybody ever heard of this? Say again? Saving the email draft. Yes. So that was one of the techniques that Al-Qaeda used for years. What's unique about that is they did, two individuals would have the same password to the same account, and the email would never traverse the internet because they were worried about the NSA specifically capturing the internet. So their way around that was to never send the email. Oddly enough, somebody tried that, former director of the CIA, and unfortunately he got caught with it. Yeah. So, but they exploited Yahoo. Eventually, though, we figured that out by people that were eventually captured, most of which were actually in internet cafes trying to do this. It's open source now, so we can talk about it. But in internet cafes, when you go to the Middle East, every house does not have an internet connection. So in most cases, it's either particularly somebody that may have a satellite device, or they have internet cafes where you go in, there's 5 or 6 terminals and anybody can come and go. It's not too hard to figure out that obviously terrorists are using those places as means to communicate. There is software that detects, when you log in, it's looking for a particular email address that they know you're in an internet cafe, and then you can catch those individuals, which is how they were caught. And then we figured out exactly what they were doing. With that said, it's one of the reasons that, and we're going to mention it a little bit more in a few minutes, but that's one of the reasons that Al-Qaeda started going dark on the internet, if you will, from a command and control and planning perspective. So just remember that key point. Oops. Here we go. How terrorists use cyber. Interesting. Well, we've talked about a few of them. One of the ones that's a little bit of a new word for a few people in here is cyber planning. They are physically using the internet to plan operations and actually execute and time these all on the internet. Why that's so key is that means that terrorists that are probably being on watch list or being looked for or surveilled never have to go out in public. This can be done virtually, and there is never a physical meeting. So it's a key point. In cyber planning, one of the interesting tools that's used. Anybody ever heard of Second Life? Okay, yeah, a bunch of people. So within that, you can actually plan an operation, execute, and you can also train in Second Life on how to make IEDs, training techniques, an assortment of other things in Second Life. And there is the anonymity factor in Second Life as well. You pick up the name of your avatar and off you go. Cyber fear, it's probably a new one. Everybody would probably realize this or know it as propaganda, or within the context of Al-Qaeda, psychological operations or psychological warfare. The individual that brought this to the forefront as a method of terrorizing people was Abu Musab al-Zarqawi in Iraq in the 2003 and 2004 timeframe. He was most noted for the horrific videos that he filmed of some of the heinous acts that he perpetrated over there with beheadings and other things. That's a key point because the follow-on person to Al-Qaeda, which is actually ISIS now, al-Baghdadi is taking this as a baseline and actually greatly expanded on it. We'll get to that in a minute. Where am I? He was so good in the 2004 timeframe with some of the beheadings and his cyber fear campaign that he actually caused coalition forces in Iraq to pull out. I don't know if anybody remembers that Japan pulled out after some of their folks were captured. So the fear mechanism with some of these terrorist groups has pretty big implications, in addition into, some foreign policy, et cetera. So how do you deal with somebody like that when they're creating so much fear on the internet just by some videos? So there's something that we kind of get our head around, if you will, from a cybersecurity point of view. Do you stop the videos, or how do you stop them? If they're posted from an anonymous point of view or websites that you can't get to, you're going to have to think through exactly how you want to attack that from a cybersecurity point of view. Data mining. We all talk about data mining. But from a terrorist perspective, data mining is completely different than, similar in some cases to marketing, but significantly different from the aspect that they can data mine. And as we talk about cyber planning, they can go to the internet. And if you just think about 3 or 4 things I'm going to talk about, so they can go to the internet, and their data mining would be a little bit different. So what they're going to look at is, think Google Earth, Street View on Google. They can surveil buildings in Google Earth. So they never have to send what we would call a reconnaissance team to actually go out to a physical site. So it's, yet again, reducing their exposure time. And in addition to that, they can follow all the roads. They can figure the way, if they're going to use a car bomb to go hit a gate at a building, they know the exact roads. They can look for road bumps or other barricades, all on their desktop computer as they go through the planning process. So their version of data mining is drastically different than I think most of us in here would think of data mining, where we're trying to understand somebody's purchasing habits or something like that. Theirs is meant to create a diabolical event at the other end of it. Fundraising. You wouldn't think that terrorists necessarily use the internet to fundraise, but they do. They do it pretty good, to be candid about it. It's an interesting way that they do it. They actually solicit charity organizations or nonprofits. In a lot of cases, they're fake. They just have that name, and nonprofit establishment overseas is far different than it is in the United States. So they set up these charities and they tag it to either Facebook or Twitter or any of the assorted other social media applications, and they fundraise that way. So you'd be surprised how much money they bring in. The unfortunate part is the people donating generally do not know that it's a front for terrorist activities. That's the key point in this. ISIS actually developed a interesting mobile app. It was called Dawn of the Glad Tidings. And they developed it for a bunch of Gulf states. And it was a mechanism to encourage donations from these folks in those areas to help fund their operations in Syria and Iraq and now Libya and some of the other places they're operating. Recruitment. Well, Al-Qaeda is previous, so I talked about the videos and how they distributed them, and there was recruitment happening that way. It was a byproduct of the videos. It wasn't a targeted effort. So Al-Qaeda was somewhat successful in the late 90s and 2000s or so. The interesting point about the recruitment is it was a recruiter may bump into somebody that had seen a video or something like that, but it wasn't their main reason for distributing these videos was to get their ideology out there and why they were fighting the West in the Middle East. They were upset that the West was in some of the Arab countries, so that's why they were fighting. Recruitment was basically secondary. With ISIS, it went vertical. They learned the mistakes of Al-Qaeda in recruitment, and they completely took over the internet when it comes to recruitment. While Al-Qaeda had a few successes with radicalizing people to attack targets in the West, ISIS has been far more successful in the recent past if you look at some of the trending. And how they accomplished that was on the internet, in blog rooms or blogs, chat rooms, social media platforms. They actually have a pool. They actually train recruiters to actually go out and target individuals. You may just be somebody looking at a website just to kind of understand what their ideology is or kind of what's going on. And the next thing you're getting engaged by somebody else. So it's direct engagement on the internet that gets feedback from the potential recruit and the recruiter. So they go through this process and they actually heavily recruit on the internet. You have a question. So out of the recruiters, who do you think they are? Men or women? Anybody have any ideas? More men or more women? It's a majority women, believe it or not. They want to entice young military-age males to come fight for the cause. And Al-Qaeda for a number of years promised, 2 or 3 wives if you come to the caliphate. They're going to give you a house to live in, and you're going to raise your kids in a caliphate. So a lot of the recruiters are actually women, and that seems to be a key to their success in doing this. So that's a very interesting little twist. You would normally think that men would be recruiting men, but not the angle that they took. Info sharing. It's taken a whole new level. When we talk about info sharing in the regular commercial world or, in universities or anything like that, we think of sharing ideas, software, and things like that. With respect to how we data mined or talked about data mining, that's what they do with info sharing. And it's far different than we would do it in a commercial setting or even an academic environment. And what I mean by that is their info sharing is horizontal, not vertical. And within that, it's not just within their own organization, it's with partner organizations, other terrorist groups. While you would think these terrorist groups don't collaborate, they collaborate at a level that would surprise just about everybody in here. And it's not only with other terrorist groups, it's also with organized crime. So they share other pictures, people to target, how they would target a particular place, how do you get into a particular country. So their info sharing is far different than we would think in the commercial world. Disseminate ideology. Well, we talked about it a little with Al-Qaeda and how they did it in the early or late 90s and early 2000s, they created a massive web audience to understand their religious beliefs as it applies to, as I mentioned, to the West. ISIS on this dissemination of ideology is less on the ideology side, and theirs is far more, as I talked about with Zarqawi. They have followed that same vein, and ISIS's dissemination ideology is actually cyber fear, propaganda, and psychological operations or warfare, if you want to look at it that way. The ideology they have is the establishment of the caliphate, but their vein and dissemination of information is clearly targeted at creating fear worldwide, which is a big difference from Al-Qaeda. One wanted to understand the religious implications. In this case, they want everybody to understand fear. So it's a little bit of a difference in the two organizations. Another unique thing about ISIS and how they disseminate ideology is everybody is seeing commercial companies like the Fortune 1000s, 500s. They all publish an annual report. Would you be surprised to know that ISIS publishes an annual report? No kidding. I've read one, translated version. It's staggering. It covers everything in the cyber fear realm. This is how many attacks we perpetrated. This is how many suicide bombers. This is how many roadside attacks. It was 100 pages of this stuff, and it covers every attack that they did. Their record keeping is phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. And they can tell you what day this act was perpetrated, how many people were killed or injured on the other side, the infidels, if you will. And they publish this in a report. So when you look at terrorist organizations, you generally think, oh, it's fractured. They may have a little continuity. They may be a little organized, but an entity that publishes an annual report, you really have to take notice of. We'll talk about that in a few more minutes. Lastly, I would be remiss. So cyber terrorism, as we talked about earlier, normally cyber terrorism is the classical definition is using the web to commit cyber acts against what we call physical infrastructure, SCADA, banks, websites, and things like that. Within the context, and I would submit, of what I've just kind of loosely talked about, and we have a lot more to go, using the internet in a manner that Al-Qaeda and ISIS, I would submit, is cyber terrorism, which differs from the classical. I would expand the classical definition to include, and the reason is cyber planning, cyber fear. They're using the internet to perpetrate an act. Well, it's not an attack on infrastructure in the classical sense of SCADA or bridges and water plants and things like that, electrical plants or electrical grid. They are using the web to perpetrate terrorist acts worldwide. In addition to that, we're also using it to radicalize, self-radicalize individuals in the United States that they've never even seen with their propaganda to go out and perpetrate acts on their own. So it's really an extension, and I would lump all this under the bigger umbrella of cyber terrorism. Now let's get to the far more interesting part, and I'm going to tell some interesting stories as we get into this. So let's reboot, and let's go to what I call cyber 2.0 and disruptive technologies. So in the early part of when Al-Qaeda was operating, a lot of the things that exist now didn't, and that had a lot to do with their ability to actually operate on the internet. Over time in the late 2000s, the internet exploded, social media platforms, mobile applications, and the like just exploded, and that allowed a lot of the things that ISIS is exploiting to actually be able to happen. So I do want to talk about and regress for a minute and talk about Al-Qaeda and ISIS. The actual lineage of what's now called ISIS. Anybody? Okay. They used to be part of Al-Qaeda. Originally, Zarqawi in Iraq was the #1 branch of Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda stayed as Al-Qaeda in 2014. And that's when al-Baghdadi split with Al-Qaeda proper. And on the same day, he also established a caliphate in the Syrian corridor. Why that's relevant is now they're foes. They used to be friends, now they're foes. So there's something that's noteworthy in that. And from some of the examples, there's a comparison between the two, and there's a whole bunch of contrast. What's now ISIS learned a lot from Al-Qaeda, and they also learned a lot from their mistakes. And over the last couple of years, their recruiting is escalated almost vertically to thousands of recruits worldwide. And a lot of the recruits they get, interestingly enough, are coming from the Arab Spring countries. So if you look at the Arab Spring countries, and as you go across the Horn of Africa, Tunisia, you're getting a few from Morocco, Libya, a whole bunch, Egypt, yes. And then it leaped. And the growing theme about those countries on the Horn of Africa is they're all Sunni Islam. So it leaped and went to Syria, which is a country that has a Sunni majority population. However, it's ruled by the ruling party in the country are actually Shia. So it's a very interesting little dynamic with where they're getting the recruits, and then how ISIS was able to establish themselves in Western Syria is because the population in Western Syria were Sunni. Even though the government was Shia, they're basically centered around Damascus. So that's why ISIS was able to exploit, when they left Iraq, the El Anbar province and went into Syria. That's why they were able to exploit the western part of Syria, and now the country is basically split in half. But they were able to exploit the Sunni individuals in western Syria, which is also where all the oil is, which is another thing we're going to talk about when you get to black marketeering. So Al-Qaeda, so that is a backdrop. So let's move this forward. So in 2007 and 8, Al-Qaeda generally went dark on the internet, except for their media campaign. For a couple of the reasons we talked about, the email. It also translates to cell phones or smartphones were coming about at the time, and they happened to be continually getting rolled up. So they went completely dark, and they went back to what they were doing in the late 90s. The handheld, and if anybody in here seen Zero Dark 30, how'd they catch bin Laden? His courier. What was he taking him? A thumb drive. So that ended up being their Achilles heel, if you will. What's interesting, though, is ISIS, as I mentioned, took a completely different approach to the internet. They view the internet or cyber equal among weapons. And actually, in some cases, they view it as actually a force multiplier versus a rifle or an IED, because they can get to such a wide audience for recruiting, fundraising through these nonprofits, and exploiting people to do things like Japan pulling out of Iraq, if you will. So it's a very different approach in how Al-Qaeda approached the internet, and then how ISIS has in the more recent past. Encrypted email. So everybody in here has probably heard of it. Hushmail, Tudornode, and an assortment of them. Those really didn't exist. They didn't come about until, some of them, 8-9 years ago. About the time that Al-Qaeda started going dark, ISIS picked up on it. So ISIS wrapped their arms around the internet. For all of the shyness and avoidance that Al-Qaeda had with the internet, ISIS embraced it. Their view is, let's use all of it. Why avoid it? We're going to use every single bit that we can. Encrypted emails, mobile applications, WhatsApp, Viber. Is it Viper? So we'll get to those in a second, but they embraced every single bit of the technology available to them as a force multiplier to plan and prosecute targets and recruit. Much different than the approach Al-Qaeda took, which is why Al-Qaeda is number 2 now and not number 1. Social media. They own a ton of the social media platforms. Some of the followers they have equate to super celebrities in the United States. It's phenomenal when you look at how many followers they have on some of these social media platforms. Within that, the same thing applies to blogs and chat rooms. They have people out there. This is where the recruiters go. That's where they're looking for these people. They spread a few messages and then see what kind of bites they get from people commenting. And they say, okay, that's a likely individual to be recruited. So they entice them, and the next thing you know, they're a foreign fighter going to fight in Syria, Iraq, Libya, or wherever they may want to go. Okay. They're also using social media and some of the other blogs, as we talked about, for command and control as well. So they've embraced doing cyber planning in any of these platforms that are much different than Al Qaeda and much different than we would suspect that they're being used for. Okay. With respect to the internet, let's talk about the three pieces of the internet. So everybody has their idea about what the regular internet is. Who in here, I was talking to Dr. Spangler about that, so we're going to ask the question. Who understands how much of the internet is the surface web, if you will, the internet that everybody knows? How much of the total internet? Does anybody have any ganders? Please. Well, a little bit higher, but so he indicated about 1%, a little higher than that. Out of the internet, though, what's considered the public internet is about 5% of the total internet. Within that, you have the deep web and then the dark web. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about the dark web. Anybody in here know what the dark web is and how you may get there? Sure, right here. I'm sorry. Yeah.
You have to go to the special made browser to get on the, I forget what it's called.
Okay.
It's Firefox, but there is something else in the other one.
I'm sure.
The dark web is not accessible through normal internet browsers. You have
Correct.
to have a special browser to access it.
Yes. So one of the more known ones is Tor, or the Onion router, which was actually invented by Google. Internet 2 actually has access that way in certain realms with that router. Why this is so unique and why ISIS has been able to increase the recruiting 100-fold is they start the recruitment process in the surface web. And all of a sudden this person disappears off of all these social media sites, and it's what we call, they go dark. And they point them to a specific place, or they walk by and they tell them, go here, and they get a thumb drive that instructs them how to download Tor, the special browser, to get to the dark web. And that's where they actually provide them instructions on the recruitment process. This is who you're going to meet. This is how you're going to get there. This is what you're going to get paid when you get there. And this is what you're going to do when you start fighting for us. So they have exploited the total internet, specifically the dark web, for recruitment and a number of other things we're going to talk about. So what else do you think they may do in the dark web where they're trying to, well, the surface web has some protections. The dark web is a little bit different. While it offers anonymity, like some of the applications doing the surface web, you're still not completely secure there. It's rather complicated. You have to go through 7 layers to get there. What else do you think a terrorist organization may want to do if they're in the dark web? Any ideas? I'm going to go through a few. So we already talked, I'm sorry? Encryption. It's encrypted, yeah. But what would they facilitate in an encrypted environment? What are they trying to do? All the way in the back, please. Perfect. He said weapon sales. That's one piece of this. So they actually can plan in the dark web in complete anonymity. While you can do it in the surface web, they have migrated and gone dark in a number of areas to plan. So we talked about to do lateral coordination with other terrorist groups and organized crime. They also use it to facilitate cash transactions. What does every terrorist group need? You need recruits and you need money to facilitate your operations anywhere you want to go. Moving people around and buying weapons is not cheap. So what else do they do? Some of the things that ISIS has already been known for. One, they tax the people in Syria and Iraq. So that generates cash. But how do they move that cash? They turn it into Bitcoins on the dark web. And that's how they move money, is with Bitcoins in the dark web. Who else is down in the dark web? Other terrorist groups, but more specifically, you know what I'm talking about, organized crime. That's the hover of organized crime. So other things they do down there, terrorist groups will actually purchase drugs. While it goes against their ideology, it goes out the window when it's there to facilitate cash. So they buy drugs and they flip it in the dark web to then turn around and, exactly as you stated, to buy weapons, explosives, etc. They also use the dark web. This is a pretty interesting one. So everybody's heard about the ivory tusk being removed from elephants in the Horn in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. Well, guess who buys them? Terrorist groups. And what do? Through the rest of their connections down there with organized crime and other terrorist groups, they flip these tusks to either drugs or straight to weapons. So that's another facilitating matter that they're using the dark web for. Black marketeering, human trafficking, oil sales, think northern Syria. And lastly, stolen IDs. So when we talk about cybersecurity, they help facilitate stolen IDs, cyber protection or lack of protection. And that's pretty much the end of the dark web. At this point, I'll entertain questions from anybody. It was rather quick, but it gave you a pretty good snapshot of what terrorist organizations are using cyber for, or what I would term cyber terrorism.
My name's Kevin. I work for the DOD. What's your thought on the ethical dilemma of free speech, free access versus what we see with allowing those things to occur over the internet? And I'll dovetail the fact that the U.S. gave up control by allowing ICANN to be released.
They did.
What's your thoughts about that? Thank you.
Great question. I'll answer. There's two parts to the question. So you talked about terrorists' ability to use the internet to perpetrate or put this heinous material out there. Did I understand it correctly? Okay. At the end of the day, you know, it's the United States. We have a constitution, and it's been determined that that's a First Amendment right for these folks. Whether you like it or not, that's been the determination. And with that said, there are government entities on some cases that years ago, you know, the standard among the government entities were, we're going to continue to crush these websites, you know, disable them. The catch is then you don't get to see what happens and who hits the website. So there's, you know, two sides of it. But at the end of the day, the Constitution does say, you know, the First Amendment. And there's been plenty of court cases that the U.S. government's lost trying to prosecute these folks. The second part is the giving away of the internet, so to say, and who maintains primacy over domain names and how that's routed around with IP space around the world. It's just happened. I think the jury is still out, but with the way the terrorist organizations are exploiting the total internet to include the surface, deep, and dark web, I think it's something that the U.S. government's going to have to monitor very closely and come up with a plan, if you will, on how we're going to mitigate risk in that environment with giving those, you know, IP space and then all of the additional domain names that are going to come of what's going to eventually morph into the internet too. Anybody else? Somebody? Sure. Yes, sir.
I can speak. Oh, they can't hear you on the live stream.
Yeah.
Earlier you said they use games to coordinate through like Second Life, things of that nature. Can you elaborate more on that?
Sure. Twofold. If you can, I'll start with Second Life. It's one that they've used to actually teach bomb making and tactics. So they actually go in and you in Second Life, you actually create an avatar of yourself, but you're anonymous, and you have an instructor out in Second Life teaching you how to do this. And if you actually have the materials at your home, you can actually see how it's done. And you can actually, they will teach you in virtual space how to make a bomb. And at the end of it, you'll have a real bomb. On the gaming side, there have been, you know, if you look at it in a number of places, they actually design games, if you will, game cards to put in like Xbox, and you can go through to basically the same thing there. So they're using every technology tool that we come up with, they're turning it around and using it for nefarious reasons. Yes, sir.
I'm Jonathan Yerby, a professor here. What information other than an awareness of the deep web and the dark web would you recommend that students come out of a program with an understanding of should there be some sort of skill set or something beyond just an awareness that these things exist and that this is where bad behaviors occur?
Intuitively, I'm going to say yes at first blush, because we always want to have our kids come out more educated with specific, knowledge. There's a number of programs that actually expose the students, if you will, to all of the tools that you can use to contextualize where somebody is on the internet. While they may be anonymous, you could contextualize and follow them across the internet among social media platforms and as they go to the deep web. Part of it is, if you have a computer lab, it's, load Tor and, start pointing them in that direction. It's slower. It's a three-way communication. It's 16-bit, but it gives them a pretty good idea of what's going on. And they can start to contextualize when you start looking around down there between chat rooms, blogs, servers, human trafficking takes place. That's the bad side of it. But, I would agree that, if more is better than less.
All right, thank
Sure.
you very much.
No, thank you.
Michael, thanks so much for an excellent overview. A little scary at points, but an excellent overview of what's out there. And one of the things we all have to deal with in this domain is, how do we divide the good from the bad? And do we want to stop the bad by getting rid of the good? So Second Life is a great example. Yes, there's been some nasty things that happen in Second Life, but there's also been some great things. The CDC had a very effective campaign within Second Life to help intravenous drug users understand the risks of it. So we always have to balance the risks and rewards with these. When he started off and talked about why these malefactors, why these terrorist organizations are using the internet, it's really the same reasons so many of us do. It's inaccessible, or it's inexpensive and accessible. You've got a global reach. I mean, think about the small businesses in the United States that have been able to have a global reach because of it. And so again, we always have this balance. And the one thing I really came away thinking as I listened to this is, they've learned an awful lot from us. What can we learn from them? You've had some excellent ideas about how they've organized and how they've used these tools. Can we as businesses learn from their best practices? I really hadn't thought about that before. So maybe there is something to be learned for sure. But excellent overview. Thank you so much for that.